joining. I just want to say thank you to Headstart and congratulations to Headstart. I think this is unofficially year 15 of Headstart, which is an incredible achievement, especially when we first started gathering and doing Headstart events back in 2007, 2008. There wasn't much of an ecosystem in India at all, and that was kind of what we were trying to do. And to see where Headstart is today, 15 years later, is really heartwarming. And thanks to all of you, Arzu, Sanjana, and everyone else who's still deeply involved in Headstart and really taking everything forward. So thank you so much for that. So we're going to talk about early stage deal terms in India. And, some of this is going to be old news for a lot of you, and some of it might be a little new. I have a slightly different take than a lot of other folks do. I'm not going to go through all of this because Sanjana already did. So we're going to dive right into it. It's going to be a relatively short presentation, but hopefully there'll be a lot of Q&A, and we'll dive into a lot of other nuances that and situations that you might be seeing. And feel free to go off topic and ask questions as well. So let's start with pre and post money. This is kind of the most basic thing that every founder needs to understand before they start raising money. So pre-money is the value of your company before you raise any outside capital. Post money is the value of the company after you raise that capital. And as a simple example, you might be raising money, you want 15 crores. Well, this is where you need to try and figure out what your pre-money valuation is going to be, because that affects your post-money valuation and hence your dilution. So in this example here, if you have perhaps doing a pre-seed round right now, you might be raising it at a 45 crore pre-money. You raise 15 crores, that makes your post-money 60 crores. So your post-money is essentially the pre-money valuation plus the amount that you're raising, and that results in how much dilution you're actually taking. In this case, it's 25%. If there's any questions, feel free to holler. There's a couple of types of instruments that people typically use to raise money. Most of the time, especially in India, you'll probably be raising money on a priced round. So you'll be using an SHA. That is an equity round. You are actually setting a price on the company and each share that is owned. There's different philosophies here. In India, most investors kind of feel like equity is ownership and we must have equity on day one. In the US, it's a little bit different. I think partly because of just overall competition, the need to move a little bit more quickly helped kind of bring convertibles and eventually safes to the surface. Convertible notes are debt, they're not equity. So essentially what you do when you're raising money on a convertible note is you're saying, look, I don't know what the price of this company is today, and neither does the investor, but we're going to sign an agreement that's going to allow us to raise money, the money that we need to get to the next stage, but we're going to push the pricing of the company off and the pricing of the shares off for a couple of years until we get to a larger equity-based round. So that's usually a Series A. And what it allows you to do is, at least in the US, in India, it's a little bit different, and most investors still don't really understand how convertible notes and CCDs work in India. And there's some legal implications as well in India. So most people have just stuck with SHAs. There is an iSafe now that I think 100x VC put out some time ago. That is also an equity round, but the paperwork is a little less complicated. So it's definitely something to look into and dive into a little bit deeper, but not everyone across India is comfortable doing iSafes. And a lot of times, the reason that people keep doing what they've been doing is because of the lawyers. So, when Shakespeare said, shoot all the lawyers or kill all the lawyers, well, there was a reason for it. Legal and financial people don't want to change and evolve very rapidly. They're very risk averse. So that's one of the reasons why long SHAs, 100-page SHAs are still very common in India, even for a pre-seed or seed stage round. Quickly, I'll finish off with what a cap and a discount are, and then I'll answer the two questions that are here. Cap. So a cap is the valuation at which the conversion to equity will happen. So in the case of a safe or a convertible, and safes are more common today than they were a couple of years ago in the US. And a lot of SaaS companies and a lot of crypto companies are incorporating their headquarters in the US. So you might be raising money on a safe if you're doing that. If you're raising money on a safe, you essentially have two real components, three actually. So there's a post-money safe and there's a pre-money safe. YC, who created the safe, first came out with a pre-money safe, which was a little bit more founder friendly. Over time, they moved to a post-money safe, which increases the dilution and how the conversion is calculated a little bit. So, but that's kind of the standard norm now across the US, and most people are just doing post-money safes. That's what investors are now comfortable with. So that's what we're kind of sticking with. The cap is the number at which the conversion will happen. So if we go back to my previous example of 45 crores pre-money and 60 crore pre-money, you in this type of situation, you might say, okay, let's raise 15 crores and let's set the cap at 60 crores, right? So the conversion will happen when the valuation of the company actually hits 60 crores, meaning when you raise your Series A and they say, okay, we're going to value this company at 60 crores or higher, the conversion for the investors will happen at 60. Now, the discount is just in case the conversion or the valuation that your downstream investors give you is lower than that 60. Let's say it's 50 and you have a 20% discount. The initial investors who came in on that convertible or that safe will convert at 40. So which is 50 crore, which is the current valuation, plus the 20% discount that comes off of that. That makes it 40 crores. If there's any other questions on that, I can answer those as well. Put them in the Q&A. Shiva, your view on pitching for funding at the MVP stage, would you recommend for or against in doing so? Well, look, I think there's always, as a founder, you're always pitching. So you should pitch, but you should pitch the right people. If, one of the biggest challenges I see amongst founders is not doing enough research on people and just kind of really just throwing a lot of darts out to see what sticks. And that can work. But what I would recommend doing is finding specific investors who invest at the MVP stage. And if you can find those investors and start pitching to them, you're probably going to get you're going to save yourself time, and you're also probably going to wind up getting that round quicker rather than pitching people who don't invest at that stage, right? So that hopefully that answers your question. Gautam has a question. I've developed a tech, did a business of 5 lakhs, invested nearly 10 lakhs in R&D. What will be my valuation? Well, the valuations are not really done by accountants, and most VCs are not accountants. Most VCs have a thing called VC math, where 1 + 1 = 11. So just because you did 5 lakhs in business and you put 10 lakhs into the company doesn't mean your valuation is going to be 15 lakhs. Your valuation could be 1 crore, it could be 10 crores. A lot of things that if you're raising money from VCs or angel investors, a lot of things that people will look at is what market comparables are. So what did similar types of companies raise and what did they raise at? That will probably help figure out what your valuation might be. And depending on what space you're in, if you're in a space that's very hot, your valuation might be higher than, significantly higher than what you might think. How to calculate the company valuation. Okay, we're going to skip that one again. KISS and KISS 500 startups. Yeah. So, Narayan, yeah, thanks for asking the question. I actually was the one who pushed for the KISS to be created for India. We spent a lot of time on that. If anybody needs a copy of that, happy to send it. In India, it never really took off. And part of the same reason as convertible notes, and CCDs never took off. They're instruments that a lot of investors just don't understand. Some investors who understand them see more risk in doing a CCD or a KISS or an iSafe than doing a pure shareholders agreement. So that's one of the reasons why those instruments never really took off in India. Now, SAFE with MFN as a side letter comes, is it to make it equivalent to KISS? What's the significance? I'm not entirely sure I understand the question, but MFN basically says that there's going to be certain investors that are going to have special privileges, and I don't remember the exact wording in the KISS, but we had an MFN clause in the KISS. The SAFE has been amended now to give YC or the investors, at least the YC folks, MFN privileges. So that allows them to put more money in at better terms than somebody else, and some other things as well. So I hope that answers the question. If it doesn't, feel free to hit me up directly. Does CCPS come under convertibles? Yes and no. So the common practice in India is to call a CCPS a convertible. It's actually not. It's not. Internationally, when you talk about a convertible, you're talking about debt, not equity. Whereas a CCPS is compulsory convertible preference shares. So those are shares, that's equity. So yes, it is a convertible, and they kind of push off the valuation of the convertible a little bit. But it's not debt. So if you want to get technical, it's not a convertible. But in common practice, yes, in India, that is what people reference when they talk about a convertible, not a convertible note or a SAFE. We're a food tech startup and third month of revenue, and we don't know how to value our company. Yeah, look, I'm going to skip valuation questions because those aren't really relevant here. Like I said, valuations are determined based on a lot of different factors, not just your financials, not just your financial forecasts. If you're a late stage company, it's going to be driven more by financials and forecasts. But at early stages, it's really not. Can you have a floor, a cap, and a discount in a CCPS? Floor, yes. Cap, yes. Discount, yes. And I've also seen some really complicated CCPSs where, if you, even the discount is kind of a stepped discount. So if you raise that next round sooner, the discount is a little bit lower. If you raise much later, like 18 months instead of 6 months out, then the discount is going to be significantly higher. Sometimes I've seen discounts as much as 50%. So the next one, is it common to see a combination of cap, floor, and discount, or do you see 2 out of 3? Yeah. So look, we're getting very much into the weeds here, but cap, floor, and discounts are very common when you're doing deals in India. If you're a US entity and you're using a convertible or a SAFE in the US, no, you just have a cap and a discount. That's it. A floor is more common if you're using a CCPS in India. And it's not a matter of what is more investor friendly or founder friendly. Generally speaking, it should be about what gets the deal done more quickly, what is more relevant, and what allows the founders to get back to working as quickly as possible. In my opinion, and this is just my opinion, the CCPS typically is a complex document with a lot of terms and verbiage that really isn't practical. And that's why I personally don't like CCPSs with cap floors and step discounts, but they are common. You do see them fairly often. Just yesterday, I was talking to a founder who has exactly that in their deal terms, right? In the last round that they raised. So yeah, be prepared for it. And I'll go into a little bit more stuff. There's a lot of questions coming in. I want to give everyone the time they need. So I'm going to move on a little bit and then I'll come back to questions again. Does that sound good, Sanjana?
Yeah, that's okay. Pankaj, I just want to take a step backward and come back to the basics of using a safe note over an equity round. Like you said, in India, it's still not very commonly used. right? So at HIC, we do promote safe notes and we work through this. I just want you to take like a couple of minutes to emphasize on the importance or on the startup's perspective, how beneficial is it for them to use a safe note versus an equity round?
Sure. So, and I'm not talking about iSafes, I'm talking specifically about safes or convertibles in the US. A convertible is debt, a safe is not. A safe is, it's a synthetic instrument. It's an agreement that, I'm signing an agreement where you're going to give me equity in the future based on certain conditions happening, right? And it's, whereas debt is, I'm accruing interest and I'm entitled to recover my money in the future. With a shareholders agreement, a CCPS, etc., one, you're going to spend a lot more on legal fees. Each CCPS that gets put together is very similar, but there's language differences that can be a challenge, or everyone wants to kind of do it their way, which isn't necessarily great. The safe is standard. There's the YC safe. That's it. Now, some people do make modifications to it. And the practice is, if you are making a change to the safe, you notify the investors that you're making a change to the safe. Otherwise, you can just go to the YC website, download a copy of the safe, send it out to any investor and say, here are the, it's a standard YC safe. The only difference between deal to deal is going to be the cap and the discount, right? So if we agree on the cap and the discount, there's no real money I need to spend on legal fees. The other benefit that founders have is, besides for saving money on legal fees, you don't have to wait for the whole round to be committed, right? So if you're, let's say you're raising 15 crores, I come along and say, fine, I'll put a crore in, right? You can send me a safe immediately. I can sign that safe and wire the money tomorrow. You don't have to wait for the other 14 crores. Now, I might come back and say, I'm not comfortable sending that in because I don't know if you're going to raise the whole amount. And if you don't raise the whole amount, then there's a problem. So why don't you get to 7 crores and then I'll send the money, right? So those are things that we can do that you can't do with price rounds, CCPSs, shareholders agreements. So safes and convertibles give founders a lot more flexibility. There's a downside though. And the downside is you don't necessarily know exactly how much equity you're going to wind up giving, right? Because if you converted the cap, you converted the discount, that changes how much dilution you're actually going to have, right? Now, in most cases, it's not a significant difference. It might be a 1% across your whole deal, but in some cases I've seen it amount to 3-4%, where the founders have come back to certain investors and said, "Hey, would you, we didn't account for this. We didn't know we were going to get diluted this much. Would you be willing to convert at a different number?" And most of the times, at least I've said yes, that's fine. In some cases, you can't do that because there are other terms that get attached, but safes and convertibles give a lot of flexibility. You can move much more quickly and you can save money by using safes and convertibles. Whereas, it's a little bit more complex and expensive when you're doing a CCPS and a SHA.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for that. I think you can move on. We can tap into the other topics. Yeah.
So we talked about this a little bit. I want to come back to it because I think this is really, really important. And, it's less of a problem today than it was 5-6 years ago, but it still is a problem, where a lot of times founders will wind up raising a relatively small amount of money. And when I say relatively, I mean relative to the whole market. You will see that, there are companies that are raising 20 crores at a 100 crore valuation on their pre-seed. They don't even have a product out the door. Well, if you're diluting 20% at that point, that's okay. That's reasonable. But let's say you're raising 1 crore on a 5 crore valuation, right? And you're giving up 20% of the company at that point. What you've done is you've raised a small amount of money that might allow you to build out the product, might allow you to hire a couple of people, but it's really not enough to get you to that next stage that you really need to be at. So you've given up a lot of equity. you have less equity to play with, and each round you're going to keep giving up more and more equity. So if you start with too much dilution right at the beginning, you could wind up owning far less than 50% of the company before you get to your Series A. So a couple of examples here. At the angel round, friends and family, whatever, your first round of funding, you dilute 20%. And some investors might come back to you and say, oh, you need to create a 10% option pool. And you need to create that before I invest, because I don't want to be diluted by 10%. So you take that dilution hit. So essentially what you've done is you've created a 30% dilution right up front. Right. Now, the option pool isn't necessarily a bad thing. Sometimes, if you're a very early stage company, you need some sort of enticement to bring employees on board, especially if they're senior employees, and bringing them in. You might wind up bringing somebody very senior in and offer them 2, 3, 4% of the company. Right. So this is where your option pool can come in handy. But at this early stage, I would say you probably want to limit your total dilution to somewhere between 10 and 15%. If it is a group of very, very high value add investors, maybe you can increase it to 20%. Don't ever haggle over 1 or 2%. It's not worth it, right? If you're getting great investors and they're moving quickly, they're giving you what you need, take the hit and move ahead. Because finding new investors and delaying by negotiating means that there's less time that you're able to spend on building the business, right? So you want to juggle the amount of time that you're spending with the money that you're getting and the value add that you're getting. If you're getting a bunch of financial investors who are basically writing a check and they're going to sit and watch from the sidelines, then you probably do want to negotiate hard, right? Because that's what they're used to. You want to negotiate hard and say, no, I'm not going to give up 20%. No, I'm not going to create a 10% option pool right now. I'll create a 4% option pool or a 2% option pool, because these are the people that I'm looking to hire. This is what it's going to potentially cost me in ESOPs to hire these people, right? So I think those are some things to keep in mind. Dilution can add up very quickly. One of the things that I like to tell my founders that I've worked with is, if you can, between the founders, if you can own 50% of your company post Series A, you're in great shape, really good shape. If you own 40%, you're in very good shape. If you start collectively, if you own less than 40% of the company, by the time your Series A is done, you're going to have a lot of challenges downstream. You're going to be probably approaching single-digit ownership in the company by the time your Series C approaches. And the environment that we're in now, there's going to be a lot more bridge rounds that are going to be happening. So there's going to be unexpected dilution as well along the way. So, keep a very close eye on your dilution, because it affects you and how much money you could potentially make from the business that you're creating. But it also affects perception, right? If a founder is too diluted, or if a founder owns very little of the company before the company's a massive business, it could deter downstream investors from wanting to invest. So just a few things there. I'm going to come back to questions and then kind of see where we can go from there. Yeah.
And yeah, thank you, Pankaj. So Pankaj, what percentage of founders do you see still falling into this trap where they dilute a lot in the angel level? Like, you see so many founders on a day-to-day basis.
So, I would say a couple of years ago, I would say probably 70% of the founders were slightly over diluted, and maybe 20 to 30% were way over diluted. I think the market has become more efficient. There's a lot more competition in the market these days. So investors have moved the bar a little bit, and they're willing to decrease their ownership stakes at the early stages. So I think at this stage, you're probably seeing maybe around 50% of founders that are slightly over diluted. And you're probably seeing 10 to 20% of founders that are heavily diluted. But of course, that is not a clear picture because these are all really early stage founders, right? So we don't know in a lot of cases what their dilution is going to wind up being by the time they close their Series A. And mind you, this is not something that only happens in India. This happens here all the time also. I've seen this play out multiple times. Some founders are able to navigate this process and kind of stick with it. Sometimes the investors will come back and say, look, we created a very large option pool. We haven't used most of it. You guys have done a great job. We're going to grant the options back to the founders, right? So there are ways of fixing this. It's expensive, but there are ways of fixing this.
Right. Maybe towards the end of the session, it'll be nice if you could also share some real life experiences that you have seen.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. Okay, so Moneydeep, how do I raise money from my startup without having a minimum viable product? Well, you got to have a lot of rich friends or family members who you really are willing to bet on you. And I'm not being facetious. Most investors are not going to bet on a first-time founder without having anything. So you really want to go to folks that know you, that trust you, that believe in you, that are willing to say, okay, we'll give you some money to help you kind of get started. It's not a great answer, and I'm sorry, but that's kind of where the market is these days. And I think it's still better today. I do see some founders that have strong pedigree. They've worked at great startups. They know how to build great product or acquire customers that have been able to raise money without having anything other than a team of 2 or 3 people. But that was really, 2021, 2022, things are changing. Investors are a little bit more conservative than they were. So I think you're going to have a harder time raising if you don't have the pedigree, if you don't have a product, you don't have a team, then you really are going to have to go to the friends and family round. What's the minimum investment amount? I'm not sure I understand. If you want to re-ask that later, please do. What other players like Accel are ready to invest seed, pre-seed without discount or cap with just pro rata rights? I think you need to do that research on your own. I don't know. I don't keep track of, who's basically giving grants away. And a lot of this is cyclical. When money is free flowing and the market is moving fast and things are hot, a lot of larger investors are going to do whatever they can to try and find companies early, and they're willing to carve out for them a relatively small amount of money to just give it away, essentially to buy an option. And that's really what they're doing. They're buying options. And when markets tighten up, when everyone becomes a little bit more conservative, like we're seeing now, you're going to see fewer of these programs. And I would suspect that at some point, if internal review shows that these programs haven't been that successful, then you might see some of those people shutting down those programs. I don't think Accel is in that boat, but others might be. What you could look at, there are a lot of incubators and accelerator programs that are funded by various state governments and the central government. So those are places where you can get some money to get started and some support without any dilution. Okay, so now we have, how does carving out an ESOP pool work? Should it be created from pre-money or post-money shares outstanding? Yeah, this is a good question. Generally, your ESOP pool is going to get created by pre-money shares, because the investors are going to come back and say, look, you're raising 15 crores on a 45 crore valuation. That's 25% dilution there, but we want you to create a 10% option pool. Now, 10% option pool, if it comes pre-money, means that you take the dilution hit, and you're essentially going to be at 35% dilution by the time the post-money is done. 10% for the option pool and 25% for the amount you raise. No investor wants to be diluted as soon as they write the check. It's just not what investors are prepared to do. And it's also the norm, right? Like ESOP pools are generally created before a check comes in so that the investors don't get affected immediately, because it's just not fair for them to take that hit. So, a lot of founders have gotten smart about this, and a lot of founders have said, hey, as soon as we set up the company, we'll create a 10% option pool. And now it's put aside, it's already factored into our dilution. So when we go in and we start negotiating that first round or first 2 rounds that we're raising, we already know that we're 10% diluted, and we start negotiating from that perspective, right? So you can flip the game that way a little bit. Okay, another question from JD. What investors dare to invest seed, pre-seed without discount? I think I answered that before, JD. No investor is going to come in and say, I don't want to discount and I don't want to cap. So yeah, I mean, it's not when investors, and I'm going to get into this a little bit, but there's one thing that you have to remember. Investors are not just investing their money. Those are angel investors. That's the difference between an angel investor and a VC. An angel investor invests their own money. So if I make some money and I decide that I want to invest it, I can decide how much risk I'm comfortable with. When I'm a VC, I'm investing other people's money. That means I have a fiduciary responsibility to invest that money in a way that will make money for my investors, right? So when I do stuff like this, I might have to do stuff like this if the market is moving very quickly and I'm missing out on deals because I'm not moving as quickly, or somebody else who's new to the game is coming in and saying, oh, hey, we're just going to give you money. Like, we don't care. We just want to buy pro rata. It changes the game drastically. And sometimes it works out, other times it doesn't. Most investors have seen that it doesn't work out in the long run, so they don't do it. Some people feel like, hey, they need to get in earlier and earlier, and they want to figure out programs where they can do that while balancing risk and return. It's not for everybody. Most people don't do it. Like I said before, I would say look for incubator programs and accelerator programs where they're doing grants, or even CIIE. They back a couple of years ago would take a significant chunk of ownership in the companies that they gave a relatively small amount to. So I'm not sure how much that has changed, but I know that there are more grant programs coming from state governments and central governments to try that. Normal exit period. Well, if you're talking about an early stage company that's raising a pre-seed or a seed stage round right now, I would say 10 to 15 years is probably the realistic exit for the company. That doesn't mean that the angels or the early micro VCs that came in won't exit before that. There might be secondary sales that happen along the way, and some people will sell part or all of their ownership during those secondaries. I raised a seed round from angel investors, and I'm looking to start reaching out to institutional VCs. What are some common red flags that you've seen? I'm assuming that you're asking if what are the common red flags I've seen in startups that I'm looking at? Or are you asking about red flags that you see as a founder might see talking to a VC? So from a VC's perspective, I think the biggest red flag is when you meet founders who are not coachable. They're not willing to listen to certain things from certain experts. They have a certain view of things, and they're just going to push through on that view. Now, that works for some founders. Some founders are just a force of nature, and they know what they're doing, and they're just going to pull everyone along on their ride to success. In most cases, that doesn't happen. So that's one big red flag. For me, another big red flag is when somebody says, yeah, I'm my co-founder, and I say, okay, well, how much do you own of the company and how much does the other co-founder own? And it's like, oh yeah, I own 94% and my co-founder owns 2%, and I have a 4% ESOP pool, or I've given 4% away to advisors. To me, that's a massive red flag, because that's not really a co-founder that you have on your team. That is a well-compensated employee that you've brought on. The way I think about it as an investor is, if I'm investing in a company at such an early stage, so it's really betting on a team of people. If that team fractures, or if that team has internal strife, or if something happens to one of the founders, will the other founder be able to, and will they be incentivized to continue running the company and doing, going all in on that company? And sometimes when you have such a wide mismatch of ownership, that isn't the case, right? So those are some red flags that I see. Yes, ESOP pool is the same as an option pool. So ESOP is employee stock option program, and in the US, we typically just shorten it to just options. I'm looking to raise about 50 lakhs from friends and family via CCPS. How to protect their interests vis-a-vis future investors? So that's a really good question. The truth is that as an early stage investor, whether you're an angel or you're a fund, you take on a lot of risk, not just from the business and all of that, but just in terms of legal documents and paperwork. Future investors many times will come along and say, look, I will give you a lot of money to continue running this business, but here are the terms, and the terms could be very onerous. And now, there's something called pay to play. Essentially, what a downstream investor might do is say, okay, I'm going to give you all the money that you want, but I'm introducing this clause that basically says that every one of your investors right now has to put in a significant amount of money, sometimes more than what they initially put in order to maintain their ownership in this company. And if they don't, they're wiped off the cap table. That stuff like that does happen. And at that point, it's your responsibility as a founder to figure out how you're going to support and maintain the relationships that you got early on that bet on you, versus the amount of money that you need now in order to continue running the business. So, there are ways around that, but it happens very often. And it happens everywhere. It's not, in one geography versus another. It happens everywhere. Typically, you'll see that type of behavior when markets get tight. You'll see that type of behavior when a startup is having trouble raising, but some investor comes along and finds that there's a big opportunity here that they want to be a part of, and they're going to take advantage of that. So, market conditions do matter. What do investors look for in a founder? That's probably an hour and a half long webinar in itself. Look, at the most basic level, I think what investors are looking for are founders that are committed, founders that have some sort of deep understanding of the problem that they're chasing, founders that have a large vision of what this could be in the future, founders that are coachable, know what they're good at, know what they're not good at, and they're not afraid to ask for help. Those are some qualities that you look for in a founder when you're writing a check. Other people look for other things. I look for people that I think are good people. Whether the business succeeds or fails is a whole different issue, but I try to look for people that I think are, people with integrity, people that are going to do the right thing, and people that are, that I feel comfortable inviting to my house for dinner and hanging out with my family, right? That's something that I look for. Other investors don't care about that. They just want to see, founders that have integrity, but they're not necessarily going to be friends with them. They're not going to be coming over for dinner, but these are people that are just going to drive straight through on a mission. So it depends on the individual investor as well. What should be the ideal equity at an early stage startup? Should be ready to dilute. I answered that in one of the earlier slides, but if you're talking about your first round, try to keep it at 10 to 15%. I'm in the business of media, and so that's a very long question. I'm just gonna skip over that, Mr. Anonymous or Miss Anonymous. Sorry. I'm gonna move on to the next few slides and come back, Sanjana. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that would be good.
Yeah. Okay. Board of directors. This is an important thing that a lot of founders overlook at times. So what is your board of directors? Your board of directors is essentially where control of the business resides. And this is where corporate governance and a whole bunch of other things come into play. So your directors have a fiduciary responsibility to do what's right for the business. And your board can be a great support structure, or it can be a real problem. I have been a part of a board where it was composed in such a way that the board wouldn't authorize us to raise more money. And the board wouldn't authorize us to raise more money because the board members, who were all existing investors, didn't want to get diluted further. And essentially what happened is it turned into a 6-month battle to try and go out and raise more money with board approval. Board wouldn't approve it. And eventually, most of us, including the CEO and COO, left, and the company eventually had to shut down. All right, so there's that. Then at the same time, I've seen board structures where the board is not micromanaging, but they're actively involved in, at least on a quarterly basis, on large strategic initiatives. And they'll open up their Rolodex and say, okay, here's 4 people that are amazing folks that we should start interviewing to bring on board to fill these roles that we have. Or here's some customers that I can put out in front of you. So putting a board together it's challenging, but it's something that you should spend a lot more time thinking about. When you're raising your first round, most angels will, in India especially, in the US not so much, but in India, you'll see angels and angel groups ask for board seats. You'll see funds ask for board seats. Funds is one thing, but angels, I would say, push back on that. If they are high value board member, then perhaps ask them, hey, we can give you a board seat now, but rather than expanding the board, we're going to ask you that you resign as soon as the Series A closes. So, and that should be documented up front, right? In other cases, when there's an early stage fund, if they're leading the round, they're almost, I don't want to say they're entitled to it, but they're almost fair in asking for that board seat, because they also have a fiduciary responsibility to their investors. And depending on what their model is, they might have to take board seats in the companies where they're leading around. So again, look for value add. And if they're adding value, great. If they're not adding value, say, look, we're going to ask that you resign when the Series A closes, if the Series A investors ask that they want a smaller board. Smaller boards are better than larger boards. Don't have a board of 15 people. Try to keep your board small, 5 people tops. If you are a founding team of 3 people, all 3 of you can sit on the board, and maybe you bring on one outside board member is completely independent, and one board member who is an investor, right? So everyone's interests are now being addressed on the board level, and you have some people that you can see where value is going to come from, and then decide where to go from there. But this is something that you should put time and effort thinking about. Talk to other founders who have either had good or bad experiences with their boards. research people before you ask them or allow them to join the board, right? And how do you research them? We'll talk to other founders that had that person on the board and say, what were they like? How did they help? What were the challenges that you had with them? So this is an important thing that a lot of founders at the early stage don't spend a lot of time thinking about because it's not top of mind. You're really focused on execution and you're focused on raising that money, but more strategic things will matter. Okay, vesting. Another thing that founders a lot of times don't realize is that you don't own your company yet. You will vest the ownership in your company over time. And usually it's 4 or 5 years where you, as a founder, will vest your equity. This is created through a legal document. It's called a vesting agreement. You'll put a vesting agreement together with your co-founders. Usually when you start your company, you will specify certain things like, okay, we're going to earn this much equity every month for the next 4 years or next 5 years. In the event that a founder has to leave because they have some family matters that they need to focus on, okay, what are the terms under which they get to keep their existing vested equity and they have to sell back whatever was not vested. So it's a contractual agreement. In some cases, you might have to fire a co-founder. Well, if you fire a co-founder for cause, what happens then? So these are things that are predetermined in your vesting agreement and they're kind of solidified. They could change. Sometimes investors come in and they'll, in their due diligence, they'll go through the vesting agreements and they'll realize that they don't like certain aspects there or certain things were left out. And they may ask you to either restart your vesting clock. So you might have started a company a year ago and had a 4-year vesting agreement in place. You raise money a year later and your investors come in and say, no, that 1 year that you were working on this, that doesn't count. Your vesting clock starts now and we're changing the vesting agreement. So things happen that it's not that it's good or bad. You should just be aware that these things do happen. So try to address them in the beginning so that they don't have to, restart the clock or recreate the vesting agreement sometime in the future. All right, I'm going to go through a couple of more questions and see where we are at that point. How are we on time, Sanjana?
It's okay. The session is so interesting. It's okay. It's okay if we go overboard.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so is there a way to avoid drag? Yeah, so I'm going to get to that a little bit later. So I'll come back to that. Are there incubators necessary for a newbie founder, and is it worth diluting shares for incubators? Do they help getting further investments? So Chinmay, I think one of the things that people don't realize is what is the difference between an incubator and an accelerator program. Incubators usually will provide you space. They'll perhaps provide you a community. Maybe they'll provide you with some introductions, but there's no curriculum-based learning. Most incubators don't invest, but they might take some equity in exchange for giving you that space, that real estate, and the resources that they offer. An accelerator program is usually a cohort-based program of anywhere from 2 months to, I've seen accelerator programs do 12-month cohorts. They will usually invest a certain amount of money. They have well-defined terms for that investment, and they have mentors, investors, and other folks that are part of their network that they will bring in for various things. So sometimes it might be a fireside chat with another founder. Sometimes it might be pitch practice, preparing you for demo day, where managing partners at from large and well-known VCs come in and help you with your pitch. So there are different things that incubators and accelerators offer. I'm not saying that one is good and one is bad. What I think that it depends on each individual. And when you go down the path of founding a company, there's a lot of soul searching that you have to do. And sometimes you don't even know what you don't know. So just plugging yourself into a community like a Headstart community, meeting other founders, talking to them, understanding, that starts exposing you to things that you may not even realize that you didn't know about. That's one. Two, I see accelerators, incubators. I don't really keep track of incubators and spend much time with incubators, but with accelerators, I kind of see them as applying to college or a master's program. If you go to an IIT or an IIM, you're not necessarily going for the education. You'll get a good education, but you're not really going there. You're going there for the brand that it offers and for the alumni network that it gives you. So accelerators are much the same. You can go to an accelerator that might be able to help you. They might provide a good curriculum to help you with product design, with help you with customer acquisition and talking to you about all of those things. Maybe they'll even offer you $25,000 in AWS credits, but they may not have a brand and they may not have a strong alumni network that you can tap into. So, I think you want to balance that, right? So some of the larger, better known accelerator programs will give you a lot of money, and they may take low double digits or high single digits in equity in exchange for that. Then there could be a no-name accelerator program that might give you a small amount of money, but take a similar amount of equity. Now it's up to you to kind of think about and balance out whether it makes sense for you and your founding team or it doesn't. Personally, I think accelerators do offer value, but it's your job to figure out which accelerators offer value. And that value can really accelerate your learning and your time to market. It may not accelerate how much money you raise, but it will accelerate certain aspects of you building out your product and acquiring users and customers, which can then help raising more money. So hopefully that's helpful. At what percent equity we have to raise fund if we have prototype of product? So Sony, I'm not sure I understand the question exactly, but I'm assuming you're asking if you have a prototype, should you go out and raise money, and how much money should you raise, hence how much dilution? If you have a product out the door, you have some users trying it out and playing with it, yes, you should go out and raise money. If you have a prototype of a product that no one's using yet, I think you kind of could go out and raise money, but you probably want to focus on investors that invest in pre-traction, prototype MVP stages. They will look for certain things that other investors won't look for, and other investors will look for other things that they don't look for. So you need to do your research. This is one thing, again and again, I see founders, everyone's looking for a shortcut. There is no shortcut. You have to educate yourself. You have to do the research. You have to figure out who, what, where, when, and why do you need to spend your time and your money on, right? And that includes investors. So, talk to other founders, understand from other founders, who do they raise from? How were they as investors? How helpful were they? Did they move quickly? Did they move slowly? Ask yourself a lot of those questions, and now start figuring out whether you should go out and raise money. And earlier I mentioned, in your first round, ideally try to limit your dilution to 10 to 15%, not more than that, if possible. How to dilute for friends and family round invest, founders share. Okay, so how much do I dilute for a friends and family round if the founders' shares are 70% and 30% during the company formation? So when any investor comes in, doesn't matter whether it's friends and family, the same economic principles apply. So there's a pre-money, there's a post-money, and how much money you raise on that post-money will dictate your dilution. So, and when the dilution happens, it dilutes every shareholder the same, unless the shareholder has anti-dilution privileges that were granted to them. So hopefully that answers your question, Fahad. Girish, what do you think about stock appreciation right plan where exercise only at liquidity event rather than ESOPs with no expiry of vested shares, even if the consultant leaves the company so they don't need to protect? Yeah, so I'm not an expert on the accounting and legal side of structuring these things. They're ESOPs, options, whatever you want to call them, definitely have certain challenges with them, especially when it comes to taxes. being forced to sell them back and acquire them. There's always challenges with that. I think if you are a serial founder, you've had past success, I think you will be given enough flexibility where you can try to innovate on certain things and like maybe put a stock appreciation rights program in place. But if you are a first-time founder, or you're a founder who you might be a serial founder who hasn't had past success yet, I think your investors might not look upon innovative ideas like that too favorably at the early stage, only because it creates a level of complication and changes the general dynamics into something that they're not necessarily comfortable with or used to seeing. So it's just an added layer of complexity that you might want to avoid. My personal opinion on this is, the jury's still out. We don't know if things like this work well and what some of the pitfalls are. At least I don't know. I haven't seen any startup that I've been involved with implement that yet. So I've seen people do profit sharing, and that works pretty well, but they're at a much later stage. Okay, so next one. What's the biggest nightmare for an early stage VC investor when they invest or look to invest in a startup? Okay, so there's a lot of nightmare scenarios, but I'll pick one. I think one of my nightmare scenarios is being completely unaware of what's going on in a company and not being able to reach the founders. I've had this happen multiple times where it's not that anything bad was happening, but the founders just went silent. They raised their money and then they went off and did what they did. And regardless of whether it's economically working out or not, it's still a scary place to be because, you don't know what's happening. Excuse me. Sorry about that. You don't know where the investment is going. You don't know what's happening amongst the founders. It could be good. It could be bad. Not knowing is probably the biggest worry that an investor has. And I'll tap into something along the lines of not knowing in a subsequent slide. Investor, when they look to invest in a startup, I think the biggest nightmare before you've written a check is the founders tell you one thing and you start getting information that is very different from what they're telling you. And that could be about the company, that could be about the market, that could be about a whole bunch of other things. So be honest and be upfront about things is a good way to avoid that. And that goes on both sides, not just the founder side, but the investor side as well. Can a founder add his or her salary in the plan details as part of their early stage funding round? Yeah, absolutely. When investors are going to ask for financials or financial projections, one of the things that is going to be a line item there is salaries. And as an investor, we want to know, hey, if you're raising a crore, you're not paying yourself 40 lakhs and your co-founder 40 lakhs and 20 lakhs is being spent on the rest of the business, right? We want to make sure that you're being compensated in equity for what you're doing, but you need the money to grow the business and hire additional people. So we want to make sure that it's being spent judiciously and correctly. So yes, you should include your salaries, and the more upfront you are with how much you're planning to pay yourself, I think the better it would look to investors. Like, hey, you're being very upfront about something like that. So that's a very positive thing. 70% and 30% are chosen as one founder work full time and the other not. Okay, well, that's a personal question. Maybe we can answer that later, Fahad. What's one Indian startup that you passed on as an investor that's now become big? Give us a sneak peek into what made you pass on them at an early stage. Well, the list is a very long list, actually. Oyo, I met Ritesh in, I think it was November 2011. It was actually at a Startup Saturday at the American Center. And Ritesh came by and, he's telling me that he wanted to build the Airbnb of India. And I think he was like 16 years old at the time. And, unfortunately I passed because I there was no team. I didn't see the market opportunity the way he saw it. And a lot happened between 2011 and Oyo becoming a massive unicorn. But I made a decision based on the information I had in front of me at that time, and it turned out to be financially not the best decision. It's a B2B business. They essentially help marketing teams. They were really early. There was another company at the same time that I was looking at. Clever Tap. Yes. Thank you, Arzu. Clever Tap. I really liked the team and what they were doing, but I picked the other company because they had better traction. They had about $1 million in revenue already, and I made that choice. And that company wound up selling really, really early on, where it wasn't, I think it was a 1x return. So we got our money back, basically, that's it. And Clever Tap is now a very large unicorn is what I would call it, right? They're on a path to becoming a unicorn. So those are two examples. I think the lesson that I've learned from that is you're betting on people, and you're betting on whatever information you have available to you at that stage. There's a whole bunch of other things that I learned about that are different, and that's more around modeling and venture models and why certain models work for some people and other models work for other people. But you're going to make some good bets, and you're going to make some bad bets along the way, and that's part of the game. You're going to miss out on some good deals because you just didn't see it, and that's okay. That's the game that we're in. What and when exit can we show for investors in the angel round? Okay, so I guess that means you're asking, like, when can you give angels an exit? You can give angels an exit anytime you want, as long as they're willing to sell and as long as there's a buyer, right? So typically it'll happen in a secondary where there's another investor who's coming in. They want to pick up more equity, or they want to clean up the cap tables, so they will offer to buy more equity. Usually it can happen from anywhere from a 20 to 40% discount to the most recent round is kind of what I've seen as general prices for secondary. Generally, when would an angel see an exit? The exit questions, they're very theoretical, right? Because as an angel investor, I don't want to exit. If I think the company's doing well, why would I want to exit? All right, like just a couple of months ago, one of my angel investments came back and said, "Hey, would you be willing to sell your shares at a 15x return?" And I said, "No." I said, "Why? Why would I do that?" One, it wasn't a very large amount of money that I invested in the first place, but if I think this is going to go well and it could be a 50x or 100x, why would I sell it today for 15x? That's one thing. But there's another side to that equation also. And it ties into some of the things that I was saying before. If I don't know what's going on in the company, if I'm not getting that much information about, where the company's at and, what's happening, are they growing, are they not? Are there problems? Are there not? Then I might say, okay, at the very least, if I'm getting 3 to 5x of my initial investment, I'll sell anywhere from 20 to 50% of my ownership and let the rest of it ride. So I get some of my money back if there's an opportunity for that. Maybe I make a small profit and let the rest of it ride in case the company becomes a huge unicorn. So, as a founder, I don't think you should go out and tell any investor that, hey, we're going to give you an exit in 3 years, because that's garbage. You're not going to do that. And if you have the money to buy out your investors, then why are you raising money anyway? Fund the company yourself and own 100% of the company between you and your founders, right? So don't go out and put your neck on the line to say that you're going to give investors an exit at any point in time. Don't do that. It's not going to happen. Not on the timeline that they want, and not at the multiples that they want. So just don't promise them that. Suppose you're running a bootstrapped company for a year, and then an investor asks to make a vesting schedule. What happens to that 1 year of work as they demand 1 year cliff and 3 to 4 years? Okay, so let me rephrase this question. Let's say you've been working on a company for a year already, and now an investor comes along and says, we want to put a vesting schedule in place because you didn't have a vesting schedule or a vesting agreement in place previously. So we're going to put that in place now. And a 1 year cliff, 3 to 4 years for a founder is normal. Actually, 4 to 5 years is normal. 3 to 4 is perfectly fine. So in terms of duration of the vesting schedule, that's fine. 1 year cliff, not as common for founders. Most founders usually vest their equity month to month, a certain percentage every month. But it's not the end of the day. And if you are convinced that you're going to be here for the next 10 years, a 1 year cliff really doesn't make that much of a difference. You can negotiate with those investors and say, look, I want a catch up of the 1 year that we've already put into the company. So, give us that catch up and, vest that 1 year and count that as part of that 1 year cliff that you're talking about. So there are ways to negotiate that and kind of get you what you want. But I think 4 years is normal. Doesn't sound like this is anything too crazy that they're asking for. Would investors invest in a single founder company with a promising MVP and good size option pool? Yes, investors do that all the time. I don't. Sir, what is the best advice for a young first-time startup founder? I wished I knew what the best advice was. I think the best advice I could give you is just keep building. Like if you're young, you have the whole world at your fingertips now, right? And you can connect with some of the best founders across the globe, not just in your city or your country, anywhere in the world, right? So, use those resources to connect with great founders, bring some of them on as mentors, and learn from mistakes that other founders have made. Just because you might wind up coming out with a product that somebody really loves, or you raise a large amount of money, doesn't mean that you have all the answers all the time. So, be humble about where you're going to go for help. That's important. And that will help get you through a lot of tough times that are going to be on that journey. I plan to raise $1 million seed or pre-series for my disruptive patented deep tech startup in renewable clean tech space against 8 million. Okay, so I'm going to just summarize this question. Should I go for strategic or pure play investors? There's no right or wrong answer here. This is really a question of what your business is and what does your business need. If you are, let's say, a travel business and you're building something in the travel space, more software based, and Expedia or ClearTrip want to invest in the company, I might say, no, don't do that so early. Because you kind of become latched onto those platforms at a very early stage, which may close other doors for you later on. In other cases, if you are a deep tech company that really does need support, either on the manufacturing side or on customer side or whatever, it may make sense to take a small amount from a strategic investor. But one thing in either case is don't give up a majority stake, and don't give up enough that they can create problems for you. So, at that early stage, you probably want to limit that one investor, if they are a strategic investor, from owning 10% or less of the company. That's kind of how I would look at it. Does lead investor have to invest a majority share in a round? So, they don't have to, but that is the common practice, that the lead investor is going to invest the largest amount of capital for that round and help you set terms that everyone agrees to. Most early stage startups and investors do not seem to be focused on governance, thinking it is more of an administrative overhead and something that slows down their pace. What, according to you, is an appropriate stage for startups to start focusing on governance? The day you start your company, right? If you start putting the right processes in place, you start building your board properly, and you do it with intention, I think that's some of the best companies in the world are built like that. I mean, look at, Tata. There's such a deep focus on governance, but it's not something that is new. It's something that has been with the company from the beginning, and it's part of their DNA now, right? So I think if you start from day one with that in mind, and you try to do the right things with the right processes in place, I think it will help you significantly. Some things can be an overhead, and sometimes you need that overhead and you need that oversight. A lot of founders are inexperienced. A lot of founders have never managed a board. A lot of founders have never been CFOs or CEOs in the past. So, sometimes having that oversight and overhead is important. How much you bring in and how quickly you bring that in, I think that depends on each individual company, the founders and the investors that are coming in, and what kind of dynamic there is between them. If there is a significant amount of trust between all the parties involved, well, maybe that overhead doesn't have to be significant. But if they're still building up that trust, maybe there's going to be more overhead initially while that trust gets formed and over time loosens up a little bit. Okay, so does not having a vesting founders agreement raise flags? It doesn't raise red flags, but it's something that will just need to be addressed, Ronit. People are just going to say, okay, well, you didn't do it. We got to do it now. All right, so it's not a red flag. Can ESOPs be set up where vested shares do not expire if not exercised if an employee leaves the company? Yeah, I mean, you should talk to your CA about this and what the best way to structure that is. Typically, if you have vested a certain amount of ESOPs, you have the option to exercise those. And if you're leaving the company, a lot of times you can exercise them, and they don't necessarily expire, right? Your unvested ones will expire, but your vested ones won't expire, and you can have a longer exercise duration on those. But you should talk to your CA about that. Okay, I'm going to go back to finishing this off as quickly as possible, and then coming back to questions if we can. Pari passu. So not all exits are equal. Talk to your lawyer and understand there is a liquidation stack that gets created with every round that you do. And there's this clause called pari passu that basically says that is an investor who comes in later at the same exit as the earlier investors. And this is a lot of times linked to liquidation preferences. So you should talk to your lawyers. You should, and this is one thing that I didn't mention before, have your own lawyers. When a founder comes to you and says, hey, you can use our lawyers. When an investor says, use our lawyers, don't. Have your own lawyer that represents your interests. They're not working for any other investor. They're not working for a mentor, an advisor. They're working for you and the company. So you should have a company lawyer and a separate personal lawyer that is going to represent your personal interests, but company lawyer who's representing the company's interests, who's going to talk to you and tell you like, hey, when you do this, this is the impact that it's going to create. So pari passu is important. And it comes back to one of the questions that somebody was asking, hey, how do I try to protect my friends and family who come in early versus late stage investors? Well, pari passu is one of those things, right? That you have to understand and keep in mind. Later stage investors usually are the first ones to get out of the company, right? So if they say that Series B and Series A are pari passu, that means they're equal. So they all go out at the same time. But Series D might be senior. So they get out first, and whatever's left over from the exit goes to the Series C, B, A, so on and so forth. Important thing to keep in mind and understand how it works. Liquidation preference, or liq prefs. These are complicated. These are ugly. And they can cause strife between founders and investors, between co-founders, between co-investors. Basically, a liquidation preference says who gets paid when the company gets acquired or shuts down, and how much do they get paid. You have participating versus non-participating liquidation preferences. A participating liquidation preference basically says that, for example, I have a 2x liquidation preference that basically says, if I invested $1 million, you first have to pay me out $2 million. Okay, just so right off the bat, just pay me $2 million because I invested $1 million. Now, let's say I own 10% of the company. If the company sold for $50 million, you owe me another $5 million on top of that because I owned 10% of the company. Whereas if it was a non-participating liquidation preference, I would only get that $5 million, which was 10% of the $50 million sale price. In this case, I got an extra $2 million. So I got $7 million with the participating versus $5 million with the non-participating. So anytime an investor wants a participating liquidation preference, push back on it. A 1x participating liquidation preference is, I wouldn't say it's fair, but it's okay. And it depends a lot of times of how you phrase that. You can say, you can have a participating 1x liquidation preference until a certain point in time. So, for example, a lot of early stage investors will say, look, if you sell the company really early, we want 1x our money back at least, right? Let's say you have an acqui-hire. We want at least 1x our money back. And if they are a large investor, they were supportive, it's not necessarily the worst thing in the world to do. But when somebody says, hey, I want a 3x liquidation preference and participating liquidation preference, and I want to exit in 5 years, just say no. But try to keep that as simple as possible. You will need to keep track of this over time for every round that you raise, because if you promise somebody a participating liquidation preference in your seed round and suddenly your Series A investor comes along and they're not getting a participating liquidation preference, now it creates problems. And they may come back and say, well, you didn't tell us this. Well, you missed it in due diligence. And now it creates a lack of trust between both sides. So try to keep it off your cap table if you can. Information rights. So coming back to what I was talking about a little earlier about not knowing what's going on, information rights can be somewhat benign, but it also, information is power. So a lot of times later stage investors don't want earlier stage investors to know what's going on, and they don't want to share information with them because of various reasons. One of the things that I think you as founders should try and push back on is when investors come back and say, oh, no, you can't share this information with anybody else. You can say, well, look, there's certain information that we need to be able to share with all of our investors because they supported us when other people wouldn't. They trusted us and they gave us money, and so on and so forth. So certain things that you can and you probably should share with them are financials, and just say, look, here are our top line financials. Maybe you don't go into every single detail, but here's monthly, quarterly, or yearly financials that tell you what trajectory the business is on. Of course, you ask everyone to keep everything confidential and not leak it out, but still, that's one thing. A lot of times people will also ask for minutes of from the meetings of board of directors, and any material that might have been shared with them, or any sort of plans that might have been agreed to, strategic plans, right? Some of those things could be very sensitive, and you may not want those things shared with all of your existing investors. So this is where information rights, need to be understood, what they mean. Usually in most SHAs, they'll say something like, there'll be a threshold, a major investor threshold, which is 2.5%, 3%, 4%, 5%. So anybody who owns that threshold or more is entitled to certain rights, like information rights. Anybody who falls below that is not. If you are a small investor coming into a company and you don't own 3% of a unicorn, are you still entitled to some information? I believe you are. And in some cases, you're required. If I'm a fund, I'm required to, at the very least, have financials on a quarterly basis because I need to report that to my investors. And in other cases, you know what? A lot of it is relationship driven. If I have a good relationship with the founders, I'll get on a call with the founders and we'll talk about some of these things, but they won't necessarily send it to me. Try to keep your investors up to date with what is happening in the company on a regular basis. And ideally, when you're a small company and you're growing, monthly. By the time you're a Series A company, it should be quarterly at the very least, right? Like it can just be a general update on where things are and how things are going, but keep them informed. It's really, really, it's a great way to build longer term relationships where, you know, you might wind up selling your company for $500 million and then move on and start something else. Well, those people are going to be some of the first people that you're going to call and say, hey, I'm starting a new company. Do you want to invest? Right. So it's helpful with that. Redemption and drag along rights. So somebody asked a question earlier about drag along. So redemption rights and drag along rights essentially say, if I'm an investor and I find a buyer, I can drag you along and force you to sell. Redemption rights basically say that I can force you to buy my shares back within a certain amount of time. In the US, we usually don't see these rights until a Series B or Series C, sometimes even later than that. Push back hard on redemption rights and drag along rights at the early stage. And if an investor says, well, it's kind of standard, and you know, your answer is that's it. It could be standard, but it doesn't make any sense. There's no reason to do that, because if the company's not doing well, we're going to look to sell it or shut it down anyway. If the company's doing well, why would you force us to sell it? Wouldn't you want to grow it? Right? So that's how I think about drag along rights and redemption rights. Push back hard. Right of first refusal, ROFR. I spelled it wrong. Sorry about that. Typically, you are going to see this in even the earliest stages. Essentially, you know, if a founder leaves or a founder needs some liquidity and need to sell their stock, your existing investors are the first in line to buy that stock. And if they say, no, we don't want to buy it, then you can go to other people to potentially buy that stock. So that's right of first refusal. Co-sale rights. If, for example, you as a founder found a buyer for your stock and you want to sell 10% of your total ownership, your investors could have the right to also sell up to 10% of their ownership to that buyer. So basically they're saying, well, if you're going to sell, we're going to sell. And whatever percentage you're going to sell, we're going to sell. Or at least we have the right to sell. Not that we necessarily will. And in a lot of cases, investors realize that founders need some liquidity because they haven't really been getting market salaries for a while. And they need to kind of pay up on their housing and debt and everything else. So, you know, the investors will be the first ones who will say, okay, yeah, we'll buy a little bit extra, especially if they know that the company's doing well. So it comes back to information, knowing that the company's doing well and saying, okay, you need some liquidity, we'll buy from you. So there's that. And, you know, here's some additional resources that I think are good reading. Unfortunately, there's not a single VC from India here on this list of resources, because most of them are not really writing or talking about a lot of things that founders need to think about when they're raising money, right? And they're not sharing a lot of this stuff. You know, what is a seed round today? Pear VC came up with this great report some time back. I want to say it was a year and a half ago or something, that basically redefined what a pre-seed round is, what a seed round is, what a Series A is, and showed that like everything's kind of all over the place. They're less about how much you're raising now, and they're more about, you know, what stage the company's at. And you can have an Adam Newman who raises a pre-seed round at $1 billion valuation also and raises $350 million. So it's all over the map. But these are some really, really, really smart people who are constantly sharing a lot of insights into how founder investor dynamics work, challenges that founders face, challenges that investors face. So it's just really good stuff. Venture Deals, in my opinion, is required reading for every founder, every angel investor, and every VC. Brad Feld is brilliant, and he's written this book that they update on a very regular basis on what's happening in the market. It is US specific, but not really too different from other markets for the most part. Instrument types might be a little bit like I referred to earlier. And that's it. So I know we are significantly over time. I still have a little bit of time, so I can answer some more questions if people want. Otherwise, we can wrap it up. Your call, Sanjana.
I think we can go on and on with questions. We could do a quick thing. You can drop your email ID if you don't mind in the chat window so that people could reach out to you.
Yeah, my email's on the screen right here.
Yeah.
So please don't bombard me with emails. I will not read them. I'm going to be very honest. When
That's all right.
I get a lot of emails from a lot of people on a lot of different topics, and my inbox currently has a little over 14,000 unread emails. So
I see why is that. There's a lot of good speakers out there, but there are very few exceptional ones. So,
well, thank you. But what I would say is, if you have questions and you do want to, engage, Twitter is a good place for it, right? Like, ask me a question on Twitter. It's asynchronous. I can reply when I have time. It doesn't have to be a long question. If there's a topic that it requires maybe a 10-15 minute discussion, okay, we can start a Twitter space, right? Like, and we can do something like that. You can also pull other people into the conversation. So I think Twitter is a good place to address some of those questions.
Right, that works. We could do that as well. My team is already planning to have you here for HSX for a physical event. I remember you stating you're coming down to India somewhere around the same time. So please do make it. I remember us discussing a couple of days back, will we have enough participants turn up on a Saturday evening because they might go partying, but looks like a good speaker can bring the party home. Thank you so much, Pankaj.
Thank you.
It was really insightful.
All right. Thank you. Thanks everyone for joining.